Hello again everyone, and welcome to today's video. I'd like to talk a little bit today about patterns. Now, we've talked many times, you've heard us talk in class and heard us talk on videos maybe as well. Of course, about the need to calculate, to think in our heads when it's our move. We always look at our opponent's last move, and whatever he or she does, if she attacks one of our pieces, we want to make sure our pieces are guarded, and then we want to look for captures and checks, both by our opponent against us, and when our pieces are guarded, us against our opponent. And nothing will ever replace that. That's really how we're going to think about selecting a chess move most of the time. However, once in a while, you might be able to recognize a pattern, and you might be able to use that pattern in one of your games. A pattern is nothing more than something that repeats itself. So the chessboard in front of me is a pattern. It's got a brown square, it's got a white square. The brown and the white squares repeat themselves. Chess moves sometimes can be patterns if we do the same thing over and over again. So a simple pattern here, if you can see the board, is the knight protecting the queen, where the queen gives checkmate to the king. It's a simple pattern between the knight and the queen. We call it teamwork between the two pieces, but it's a pattern. It's the same thing. It's a pattern. Now, there are some more complicated patterns, not a lot more complicated, but more complicated than just queen and the knight giving checkmate, a simple checkmate. And many of these patterns can actually happen over and over again in our games. I know in my games, I've used many of the same patterns multiple times, many times. There's one or two special patterns I've used probably dozens of times to win games. When you use the pieces in the same way, the same pieces guard the other pieces, with the same team of pieces works together to do the same thing, except in a different game. So if you can remember even a few of these patterns, you'll find that maybe you can use a pattern in place of sometimes having to calculate moves out. You can just recognize that the pieces are in the same squares, or they can be put on the same squares, and they can do the same thing as in one of your previous games. So what I would like to look at today are three of the more common patterns that you might see in your games. And once you recognize these patterns, you can maybe start to play for them. Try to set up the same moves in your own games. Okay, so let's turn over to our trusty little computer over here, our laptop, and let's look at three of what I think are the more popular patterns that can happen over and over in your games. Okay, the first pattern I'd like to look at here is called the Greek gift. And if you notice, both sides have pretty much developed. White is not castled, black is castled. Both sides have brought out their knights, and both sides have brought out as well a bishop. It's white's turn. It's called the Greek gift. It starts with white giving up the bishop for a pawn on h7 to get a check. Watch this. Bishop takes h7 check. King really should capture the piece, otherwise it's just going to be a pawn down. So king takes h7, and now white plays knight to g5 check. And there are a few choices for black here. The two most obvious are king back to g8 here, or king to g6 here. Let's look at g8 first. So king back to g8. Now white comes strongly in with his queen on a nice open line. Queen h5 threatening checkmate on h7. Black has only one really logical move, and that's to move the rook to try to make an escape square and block with his knight. And white plays looking for a check, queen h7 check. Black has one move, must move the king, king to f8. White plays queen to h8 check. And again, black has only one move, he must interpose his knight, block with his knight. And now white has another check, knight to h7 check. Again, black has one move. These are all forced moves by black. And now white wants to bring another piece into play, and he plays bishop from c1 to g5 check. Now, here's where a couple choices for black it has here. Black can just choose to give back the piece. Essentially play knight here, let white capture back the piece. He can't even retake with the pawn, otherwise he'll he may drop his queen here, king here. White can't capture it yet because he would lose his queen, so bishop takes queen, rook takes queen. So what he would do back here is, so king moves, he would simply capture the pawn, queen takes g7, and white at this point would be 2 pawns ahead. He'd be clearly, well, is he 2? He's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He's got 7 pawns to 5. He's 2 pawns ahead. Black's king is on the run. White clearly is winning here. What would happen probably, though, most players would probably look out, rather than giving the piece back, after we play bishop to g5 check, most players would probably look at playing f6. But on f6, white plays queen takes g7, checkmate. So it ends the game immediately. So one way or the other, white either wins 2 pawns, ends up 2 pawns ahead, or he checkmates black. So let's start this over again. Let's have a peek at this again. So the start of this involves giving up on h7 our bishop on d3. And again, this is only possible because the black knight, rather than being on f6, which is a natural defensive square for the king, the knight is on e7 rather than f6. So on f6, it would, of course, be able to guard the pawn, but it cannot on e7. So that's why, that's what allows this sacrifice to happen at the very start. So bishop takes pawn check, bishop takes h7 check, king takes bishop, knight to g5 check, king, we're going to look at king back again, and queen at h5, and at this point white wins, as we looked at. Now those of you who are a little sharp-eyed might want to ask, well, on knight to g5 check, why can't the king move out to g6? And of course the answer is he can. This is maybe the little better approach for him, maybe, but this still leads to not good things. White at this point plays h4 with the threat of simply h5. Threat of h5, king to h6, and a knight moves, discover check. The king would be in check from the bishop on c1, and the knight could move to, say, e6, and then capture the queen. So this threatens to win black's queen. Maybe black's, he can play 8 to h5 or e8. E8 is likely what most players would play. And at this point, white plays queen to g4 with the threat again of a discovered check, moving the knight, discovered check out of the queen. It's getting difficult. The king is stalemated right now. The king cannot move at all. Can't move to f5, can't move to f6, it can't move to h7, can't move to h5. It could move to h6, but again, if the king, should the king move to h6 at this point, we again get a discovered check here. We would get knight takes e6, discovered check, king moves to here, we would get queen takes g7 checkmate. So king probably does not want to move to e6 to h6, excuse me, at this point. So maybe the best move is knight f5, which allows h5 check. Now he must move to h6. There's really no good option. I'm going to move our knight back to e4 check. Again, discover check. There's really only one realistically good move here. That's to h7. And now we play the very, very strong h6. What this move does, in fact, is if he plays knight takes pawn check, we have the startling knight to f6 check. So h6, the threat is simply pawn takes pawn, discover check out of the rook, and checkmate here. So if knight takes pawn, knight to f6 check, excuse me, forking the queen and king, forces pawn takes knight, rook takes knight, checkmate. Rook is guarded by the bishop again on c1. So one way or the other, let's go back, take a quick look at the g6 line. I realize this is a little complicated, but these are forced moves. It's looking for checks, and once you've seen these a few times, you can basically find this pattern in your games. This will occur many times in your games, and you can simply win the game by just remembering the pattern. Nothing more than remembering what happened. The pattern. Let's say he goes to g6. Whoops, excuse me. Let's try that back again. Say he goes to g6, not g8. h4. Queen to e8. This is a logical move. Queen to g4, threatening a discovered check. Moving the knight, discovered check. Knight to f5. Again, black's probably only reasonable try to defense. h5 check. King to h6. Knight on g to e4, discovered check. Forcing again king to e7. And now h6. Threatening pawn takes pawn. Check. Threat is mate in 2. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn check, discover check out of the rook, king moves back, and then rook mates on the back rank. So threatening pawn takes pawn. Whoops, let's back this up again. I can't use this. Threatening pawn takes pawn, discover check, king back, and then rook would come down, checkmate, guarded by the pawn. So we must do something about that. Knight takes pawn is really the only reasonable try. He could play g takes pawn. On g takes pawn, can capture here. Can knight to, well, just allows knight to f6 check. Wins the queen and will lead to mate probably sometime soon as well. At this point, king to h8. He can capture the queen or just take the pawn here with the threat of moving, checkmate. So h5, king to h6, knight to g4, king to h7, h6, knight takes h6. And now the startling knight to f6 check, wins the game on the spot, forks the queen and the king. Even if he chooses not to capture the knight, let's say he moves king back, you can simply capture the queen on e8, or you can capture here. Either way, the game is lost. So one way or the other, the Greek gift sacrifice, if you can get this position, will in fact win. And again, the key point is that your opponent has the knight on e7. It can be with white or black, by the way. You know, the king knight is on e7 instead of f6, and it allows this sacrifice, allows the knight to come strongly into play, and you have not castled yet, which is something I don't want you to not do, but this is part of this sacrifice. If you can reach this point in your games, you can win many games with the Greek gift sacrifice. Let's look at another sacrifice. It's called the Arabian mate, and this is another very, very common one. This is one that, that again, once we learn this, you can find it in many of your games. This one involves just simply the rook and the knight. So if it's white's move, white would play rook to h7, checkmate. The knight guards the rook. The knight controls the g8 square. This is checkmate. This is the basic position of the Arabian knight mate. It involves the rook and the knight, where the knight guards the rook. But this can come about in many ways in our games. So let's look at one of those ways that's able to happen. Okay, this is one of my own games. Okay, and this is and I was able to reach the Arabian Night point. Now, if we look at here, this is a lot going on in this game. Okay, White's a knight ahead. White has an extra knight way over here on b6, but Black still has his queen on the board. He's got both of his rooks on the board, so he's a knight down, but there's a lot of fight left, so to speak, for Black in the position here. He's got a lot of heavy pieces left. It's White's move. It's my turn here, so I had spied this possible Arabian Night mate, and I wanted to set it up. So I played queen takes queen. Black must play rook takes queen. And now I played my rook on the open G file. Notice this nice open file for the rook, way down to G8, threatening. And if you were watching previously the basic Arabian mate, the threat is rook to C8 checkmate. And in fact, there's no good way for Black to stop this Arabian mate. He cannot put anything in the way. He cannot move his king to here because the pawn is here. He can't take the knight. The knight's guarded by the pawn. He can't move to the back rank because of the rook. He can't move here because of the knight. You know, the only move he has really to stop the mate immediately is rook down, and White simply captures the rook and will still checkmate him on C8 with the Arabian mate checkmating pattern where the knight guards the rook. This Arabian mate happens in many ways. This is just one of the many ways that you can use the rook and the knight to mate once you start to know that it exists and look for it. A third pattern that I think is worth looking at is called Philidor's Legacy, and it's named after a chess player from the 1800s, well, late 1700s actually, named Philidor, Andre Philidor. He was one of the first early chess masters out there who really tried to do some thinking about theory and thinking a little bit about the game. If it's Black's move here, let's look at Philidor's Legacy. Okay, if it's Black's move here, obviously Black has a knight fork. Let's start with the simple knight fork. And there's one move for White, king here. Now, Black can simply take the rook here. Okay, and the game will continue. Black will likely win, but White still's got a lot of pieces on the board. White does not have his queen, but he would still have all four of his minor pieces. He'd have all his other pieces. Okay, so this might be a long game, with the exception of losing a rook. Here he'd have all his other pieces. This might be a long game. Black would probably win because he had the queen, but this could last a while. But if we use Philidor's Legacy, so what we can do is we now play a knight discover check. We can have a knight discover check here from the queen. We can play knight takes rook discover check. We can play knight to h3 discover check. We can play knight to g4 discover check. Let's play knight to h3 discover check. This is the Philidor's Legacy pattern. Okay. Sorry about that. Get this a little straight again. In Philidor's Legacy, now again, if White moves here, we have queen to f2 checkmate immediately. So White doesn't really want to move into checkmate. So let's say he goes back into the corner of the board. Okay. Knight to h3 check. He moves back into the corner of the board. King h1. And now, this is what really gives Philidor's Legacy the, well, popularity, and this is what it's known for. White gives up his queen. Black, excuse me, gives up his queen. Queen to g8 check, forcing rook takes queen. There's no other move. And now Black mates with knight to f2 check, what's called a smothered checkmate. So let's see this again. This is again a pattern with the queen and the knight giving checkmate. It's not a lot of pieces, but it is 4 moves in length. And you can find this many times in your games if you start to play for it, if you start to look for it. So, once again, knight check, king to g1. We play knight to h3, discover check. White goes king into the corner because he doesn't want to get mated immediately. Whoops, excuse me. He doesn't want to get mated immediately, so he moves king to the corner. And now we play queen at g8 check. The knight guards the queen, so the king can't capture it. The rook must capture it to prevent checkmate, but it doesn't. It only prevents it for one move. And now we play knight to f2 checkmate with a smothered mate. Philidor's Legacy. Another popular pattern, a pattern that you may see in your games. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned a little about patterns. I still want us to always look at our opponent's last move and make sure everything's guarded, and we always want to think in chess. But once in a while, if we can shortcut the thinking process by seeing a pattern, by seeing something that we recognize, the use of pieces for several moves in a row that we recognize, use your pattern. If you can use the Greek gift, if you can use the Arabian mate, if you can use Philidor's Legacy, use a pattern. It'll help you win the game a lot faster, immediately, in these cases, and save you from doing a little thinking too. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time.